So the two type of monochrome paintings we're going to be looking at for the next many weeks are what's called an open grisaille and a closed grisaille. Grisaille just means gray or neutral tone, and open or closed refers to the paint film that's on the canvas. So an open grisaille painting is a monochrome painting where we're using the white of the canvas to provide the white of the painting. So you wouldn't necessarily tone your canvas in the beginning of this type of painting because if you can't get back to the white, then you sort of shot yourself in the foot here. It's going to be very similar to how we execute just a normal drawing on white paper. The same ideas hold through. We're going to need we're going to apply the paint sort of scumbling and scrubbing it on as if we were stumping in charcoal. For fine areas, we're going to use a small brush and get in there with little detail bits, and then for reaching back down to the white, we'll wipe out with a paper towel or even a white click eraser. A white click eraser will work great, especially if your paint has set up enough to be a little stiffer. You'll be able to veil with that white click eraser and lift off to gradually reach the white that you need. So it's going to be very, very similar to how we worked drawing for quite a long time. Now, this isn't a typical way to produce a finished painting, of course. It's not making really a viable paint film. A painting that's done entirely in open grisaille is liable to some structural issues and could crack and flake off over time. This is typically used for just an underpainting, where we would go and apply paint on top of it and perhaps allow some of this underpainting to show through. It's a very, very common working method, very historical as well, and we can look at a lot of paintings and actually see this open grisaille poking through, this underpainting poking through. And a lot of the examples we have for you up in class, you'll be able to see where that was achieved. And it has a nice quality, finished quality when you observe a painting like this, just because it breaks up some of the monotony perhaps of a single passage of paint or a large shape, and allows for a little bit of optical vibration, we would say. So a color underneath, sort of optically mixing with the color on top of, but not blending together to get muddy. This was common in impressionistic paintings especially. The canvas would be toned or executed with an open grisaille underpainting of a brilliant orange or pink, and then strokes, opaque strokes, would be laid on top of it, allowing that pink to show through. So it would brighten the painting and make it glow a little bit more. Also done with figure paintings, typically in an umber or a sienna. That way, if colors were to show through, or the canvas were to show through, it would read more as a flesh tone poking through and can help to unify the overall flesh tone colors. It's great for achieving textural effects such as wood or wood grain. If the toning of a wood table or chair or something like that were executed with a burnt umber or burnt sienna, and then a sort of open brushstroke of opaque paint is laid on top of it in somewhat of a claw-like fashion, it can indicate the striations and grain within the wood once that brown paint is allowed to show through. So there's a lot of advantages to being able to do this type of painting. We're going to carry this out as far as we feasibly can, but you must keep in mind that the typical underpainting that's open grisaille is not executed to a full level of completion. We wouldn't take this out to a full range of value, a full range of edge work, and resolve all of the detail with a typical open grisaille underpainting. It's just meant as an indication of where to place shapes, an indication of value, and sort of an indication of about the level of detail without being too precise or anal retentive about it.
Will this exercise that we're doing, you'd expect to take that a little bit further?
No, you'll have this week and next week, and that's pretty much it. And then we're going to go on to the next assignment. But you will most likely start each painting with some form of open grisaille blocking.
So the purpose is really we're learning how to do underpainting? Is that primarily what
underpainting, and also how to begin the initial stages of a painting. So you're going to have 4 hours total to execute this painting. So the typical underpainting or prep work you might do before launching into a painting would be somewhere between 2 to 4 hours. figuring out the drawing and value and placement and things like that. So like an open studio painting where I'm only spending 3 hours on it, like the one upstairs that's on the board, the first hour was spent with this open Grisaille block in to really resolve a lot of the issues and think about where I want to take it. And then the last 2 hours is spent putting actual paint on.
If you liked what you did, can you preserve it with any kind of sealer or anything that would make it more stable?
A varnish on top of it will help stabilize it and maintain it. Provided you're working with a pigment that is not subject to a lot of UV damage, so you wouldn't say do an underpainting necessarily in alizarin crimson or a monochrome painting like this in alizarin crimson because it might fade over time or start to crack severely. But one of the more stable pigments, the earth tones particularly, seem to do fairly well. We have some good examples of them surviving a test of time. Consider it like charcoal, really, because this is being spread so thinly that you're stretching the paint film out to the very bare minimum, and it's almost like powder going on there, slightly wet powder going on the canvas. So same sort of preservation rules apply. And if you're working on a board, you have a much greater chance of it lasting than a stretched canvas where there's a flex involved.
Would you consider whether the paint is opaque or transparent when you're going into a garrison?
Yep, everything should be transparent
Okay.
when we do this. The only possibility for opaque will be towards the end when you get some final accents in the really dark darks. So if you do start to get opaque too soon, you're going to need to step back and figure out how to make that film a little more transparent.
So my ivory black, which is what you specified, says opaque on the tube.
Uh-huh.
Will that be less of a factor as we thin it down with?
Yeah, you don't need to worry about the actual paint, whether or not the pigment is transparent or opaque. You just have to worry about the film that you're creating on there. So,
So you could
yeah,
do it in
it
open.
certainly won't matter.
So you could do it in an open.
Yeah, you can do it in any paint. It doesn't really matter. We are going to thin this down considerably. And so this is not like a glaze, this is more like a scumble like we did the other day. So remember how we scrubbed the scumble on, so even with an opaque paint, we were able to achieve a little bit of transparency with that. So that's kind of what we're looking at here today. Keep in mind though, that as we were talking about with your darkest darks being reserved for your, or the opaques being reserved for the really darkest darks, the darkest dark in your painting can only be as dark as the paint you select. So if you're selecting something like burnt sienna or something like this, that's that value, that's as dark as you can go, meaning you're shifting your entire value range up a bit. You're keying it higher. If you select black, obviously, you have the full range of values to be able to potentially reproduce what you're painting. So that's something to keep in mind as well, because if you're working with a color that's less dark than black, then you're not going to have completely true values in your underpainting. It's going to be adjusted a little bit. Any other questions before we get started here? All right, so we're going to go for about 45 minutes here. The tools I've got are some bristle brushes of a variety of sizes. I'm going to want to use basically one brush for putting on paint and one brush for lifting off paint, if that makes sense. And this will get you in a good habit of a brush for lights and a brush for darks. The quick eraser is going to be used primarily for lifting off in small detail areas, which I probably won't even be getting to today. If I do, it'll be most likely a little more toward the end of the session when I'm starting to get into smaller little bits. But if you try to go in too soon with this, you're going to notice that the paint is too slippery and you're just more going to push it around than lift it off. You do want it to set up a little bit, let some of the mineral spirits evaporate a little bit. And keep in mind that next week you can even go in when the paint film is much drier and actually lift off with the eraser a little bit easier than you'll be able to this week. Or I'll say a little bit more controllable than it is this week.
So other than just to set the lightest light and darkest darks, we should maybe concentrate more on the lights this week because otherwise it'll be too dry to manipulate next week. The darker darks.
No. So, guys, I will ask you this too, especially because we're videoing this and people are going to watch this. If you have a question, make sure you do phrase it in the form of a question and not as a statement, because sometimes when we're watching videos and things like that, and you just pick up a little snippet, if you hear somebody in the video say something wrong, and that's the only thing you heard out of context, then you might be picking up wrong habits. So make sure you're very clear about phrasing things in the form of questions and not statements. Other things you're going to need here are the paint thinner. You won't require any medium this week, especially if you're working with something like the painting medium here, because it's going to form a very strong paint film compared to the mineral spirits, which may make it very challenging to erase later on. The paper towels I recommend are stiffer paper towels if you have them, and we do have some upstairs. If you use something that's really absorbent, you may completely wipe off your paint film instead of just adjusting a small area. And these can be formed into shapes quite a bit more precise and smaller and angular and rigid than the soft paper towels. All right, so the copy I have here is an 11 by 17, and I'm working on 11 by 14. I do want you guys, if possible, to work side size. It should be very possible to do that. And the way your canvases and easels will be set up upstairs, your reference will be directly next to your canvas, so you shouldn't have any issues with being able to take a measurement right off of the board. Since I'm a little further back, it's going to be a lot more work for me to lean in and compare. So I am going to do side size, but I'm going to do side size from back here. So my image will be a little bit smaller, but you guys should be able to work directly the size that you see. All right, so I am going to get a little bit of tone here because there's nothing on here that is pure white. So we're going to knock this down a little bit.
What size of board are you using?
This is 11 by 14, so this is the size board that's on your recommended supply list.
So if we got a smaller board, within the range, it's still okay, we'll just do a smaller piece of it?
That's absolutely right.
Okay.
Yeah. Because in the amount of time we have, there's no way you'll be able to manipulate the paint to really get this finished in the amount of time you're going to have to work on it. So a small section is fine. And then if you want, you can take this home and finish it out more later on. Keep in mind also that this assignment is not about mimicking the actual brush strokes that you see on here. It's about learning to manipulate the paint and get the values and get used to drying times and things setting up and et cetera, et cetera. The next assignment that we have with the closed Grisaille will be more thought intensive, where you'll have to really observe the direction of the paint stroke, whether it's soft, whether it's claw marked, whether there's underpainting showing, et cetera, and you'll have to be reproducing that in your painting. So the next one will go really slow, but more so because you're contemplating how paint had possibly been applied to achieve that same effect. So the examples, again, that we have for you should be pretty obvious, well, relatively obvious compared to other examples. And I did exclude a lot of the really tight academics, so you're not really going to see Bouguereau or Jerome, because some of their finishes are so flawless you can't see where the brush stroke is, so that kind of defeats the purpose of this exercise. So for the most part, we have slightly looser type of examples, or for example, there's a Sorolla. There is a Godward in there, but you can really see the texture and the scumble in it and things like that. So we'll have a bit of a variety. All right. So I'm just kind of keying in some of the background. My paint is getting less and less soupy, and I have to be careful. Right now I'm still kind of in a preliminary stage where it's okay if things change a little bit. I'm just really getting a kind of really basic no tan on here, trying to keep things really thin. And there is some mineral spirits on here. However, they're drying rather rapidly, so I don't have to worry too much. The real thing to remember here is to just make sure everything is kept relatively thin as we work.
So if you, paint something out that eventually you're gonna wanna lift and you do it thinly, is that a problem, or are you still
No.
gonna be able to lift it?
Yeah, you'll be able to lift it. This is because I put oil primed linen on the supply list. You will be able to lift this, most likely even next week too, if you come in and realize that there's an area that really you shouldn't have made dark and you need to get back to a much wider area. You'll be able to lift it up to next week without any issues. And you should be able to go, at least for today, down to the white of the canvas if you need to. So I'm really going to open up your method here. You can draw this how we drew drawings last time, starting with a box and scheme and whatnot. So you can see I'm kind of doing that with the paint right now. Or if you think you can go right in for the kill, you do it, whatever you want. I'm not really going to be critiquing your drawing here. It's just a given at this point that you know how to draw. So you do whatever you want to get to the end result as far as drawing is concerned. But I certainly won't be trying to get you working into any particular drawing method. You can start with a no-tan and then develop it out from there, or you can start with a line drawing and fill it in. This exercise will be too brief for you to execute a transfer drawing, but it's something to consider in the future.
We use a transfer drawing for our home assignment.
For your if you want to do a drawing and then transfer it, yeah, you can do that. That's a great idea. Notice how I am using a very large brush. You should certainly be thinking large brush to small brush, large brush to small brush, especially since I can just turn this brush on its side and be able to get a very fine mark like that. There should be no reason to do a very small brush at this stage. And this is quite better for carving out large shapes. Some people like painting more than drawing, and one of the reasons is you can get things done much faster just by using the broad side of a brush. So right now I'm just kind of thinking of the shape of this figure. Yeah, that's about right. And notice how I'm not really concerned with how my brush strokes are softening into each other yet. I just want an idea right now to get the shape and the initial value placements. Kind of like I'm thinking in terms of what would this look like if I had drawn it in and then stumped it across. That's kind of what I'm trying to shoot for in these initial stages here. So if you haven't received your drawing certificate, this figure blocking may take you so long that you don't get to focus on the other advantages of this assignment. So I think we have a Levitan that you can potentially copy. The sleeve of a Rembrandt painting is a good one. What else do we have? A Corot landscape, which is a good one. Right, a few nice ones.
We get to hang on them until we're done.
Do you get
Our copy?
the reference?
Right.
Yep, yeah. You can do whatever you want with it. The school will print these out for you, unless you want to work off of one of the big ones that we have from drawing. You're certainly welcome to do that. Those, for the most part, are very high quality, and the brush work is very visible on many of those. And the color certainly would be much nicer. That arm is in shadow, so I'm just kind of thrusting it in shadow right now. So if this were, say, an open studio, this is the stage we'd want to get to in the first 10 or 15 minutes. Because it's still flexible enough right now that if I decide that something is really off that I don't like here, I can just smooth this all down and reblock something in. Notice also that I'm really trying to keep my line usage at a minimum here. Instead of drawing the outline of the figure, you notice I'm using the large broad side of the brush and actually painting some background. So we're trying to break away when we get to actual painting of this theoretical idea of the line and into this idea of shape. So certainly I'm trying to get the outer contour of her body here, but I get that by either actually painting a stroke of her body in there or painting the dark of the background in there. So that's the decision you'll make. With an open Grisaille painting, it's pretty easy to figure out what you're going to be doing because it's much easier to manipulate shape with dark than it is to manipulate it with light. So it makes more sense in this case for me to paint the dark background than it does to try and use a paper towel to carve her out, especially since she's kind of dark right in there, or mid-value. So I'm going for the no-tan here. You guys can kind of see this no-tan on her if you squint. And I am still squinting a lot. You'll never get away from squinting even when you're painting.
Tim, what is that sort of C-shaped thing on the right side? The bottom of her arm?
This?
Yeah.
It's a few strokes of her bottom arm.
Okay. Because from back here I can't really see that.
Yeah, it's. I'm using darker color here to carve out the side of her leg.
Okay.
So that the dark line on the left, would that be the equivalent of a core shadow then?
This?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or not the equivalent to this?
So I need to go in here and clean up this pelvis shape. I'm using, there's no paint on there, a clean bristle brush here to just push back that shape a little. You see how I did that? Smooth that in a bit. This should go a little more out. Let's do a sight size test. Good. So I just took a sight size measurement from here to here to make sure the adjustment I made was correct.
And are you using a dry brush, not one that has
Correct,
mineral spirits?
yes. Because I'm really trying to lift some paint off to help describe that. And this is all of the mineral spirits I'm going to use in this painting. That's it. What you saw in that very beginning for those initial placements and marks. If I keep using mineral spirits and thinned out paint from here on out, instead of layering on, it's going to push aside what's there to make room for the new paint that has mineral spirits in it. Because that mineral spirits is a thinner, so it's going to thin down whatever's on there and then push it aside, and then it's going to be really hard to control the buildup of paint here. So this is getting to a point now, as you can see, where it's starting to evaporate and be pretty pretty dry on there, but you'll still be able to, if you need to, something like this. So roll up the little paper towel, put it in a mineral spirits here, and then I can get down to the white of the canvas if I need to. So it's dry, but it's still very, very workable and very, very correctable. After this week, you might not be able to get, like I said, down to the white of that canvas by doing that trick, but you'll be able to use your eraser and start to modify it a little bit fairly successfully. Oh, we're going to have to use another piece of tape on her. I am going to stay away from that area for a little bit though, because I want those mineral spirits to evaporate out. I don't want to inadvertently pull them into an adjacent section. So now I'm just using the pure paint here, and I'll pull some paint into the brush and then scrape the excess aside here on the palette. And then if I need to, if there's still a lot on here, just like we did with the scumble, I'll pull off the excess of the paintbrush. So then I can start modulating some values and applying some paint in here without it really disrupting what's underneath. We're just going to build it up this way.
At the end of this, would you actually have the background as dark as it is? Or at least...
That'll be the plan.
Okay.
But to do that, I may have to get quite a bit more opaque. I mean, as you can see in here, it's still transparent there. I can still see the canvas. But it's still got a little bit more to go. Not too much more, but a little bit more to go than that. So it won't be like a body stroke, certainly. It'll just be a heavier scumble.
That body stroke and full body paint.
Right. Yeah, if you cover up the texture of the canvas, your paint film that you've just applied is probably too thick. Carve this down a little bit.
At this point, are you correcting shapes also?
Absolutely,
Okay.
yeah. I'm correcting and refining shape. So if I need to nudge a little shape over and add a little more information to an area. Still, I'm still kind of wanting to work from big idea to little. For example, I'm not going to get too hung up in all the anatomy of the back right now and get all these value changes in here before I've started to indicate some of the major values and changes around the whole torso. I want to think big idea to small idea still. What's going to happen, the more I work in a certain area, the strokes that I initially put in here are going to start to disappear and dissolve and fold away. So if those strokes are something you want to retain, you have to be quite a bit more cautious, especially in the beginning, to try and get them to be closer to what you want as far as value and direction, if that makes sense, because you don't want to have to go back in there later and be adding mineral spirits to try and achieve these big washy strokes like this, because it may just drip down and ruin your whole painting. So that is something you'll have to have a little bit more foresight if you're going to achieve. See how I'm holding my brush again? How we do the scumble, like you're scooping soup out of a pot. It is like watching it dry. It'll probably dry even before we're done here.
You weren't supposed to hear that.
Oh, sorry.
He's got great hearing.
Well, the camera will probably pick it up, so we should make some humorous comments for the camera. It'll make this less painful. Correcting the shapes, correcting the shapes. Lots and lots of correcting the shapes. That's another reason some people like painting more, is they get to do all these problem-solving things at once. So if you're the type of person that likes to think about a lot of stuff at once, then doing the drawing while you do the painting is certainly more advisable, because it's more mentally engaging. You do have to have a fairly high level of focus to be able to do it. And we're not even doing a full painting here. This is just drawing with paint basically right
Oh,
now.
no.
So, this is separating these steps a little bit as far as shape, value, edge, and color. With this stage, you can really get your shapes figured out as well as really solid value placements. So because of that, most artists generally prefer to do some type of open grisaille block-in before they begin a painting. Otherwise, there could be a lot of reworking that you may have to do while you're painting.
Okay, you talking just figurative, is that anything?
What's that?
Just figurative painting or any subject?
No, any subject. Especially subjects that are reliant on paint application and texture. So like landscape, for sure. If you don't want everything to have the same brush stroke and same texture, you have to think quite a bit more about those elements. So if you can figure out the drawing and the values right in the beginning, it's going to make it easier to focus on just paint application down the road. So you can achieve trees and rocks and clouds and stuff fairly easily. Plus, even in something like plein air painting, landscape, the lighting is going to change and sometimes the subjects themselves change. So you're going to be a lot safer by doing at least the first 5 or 10 minutes like this, getting everything, your values and everything squared away for the lighting condition as you see it, and then start to lay in colors, and then don't adjust the drawing unless you absolutely have to. Because this is a really good problem-solving stage right here.
It almost feels like you're creating a coloring book. so you already have this guide to tell you how to do everything.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah, but even a more advanced coloring book.
Oh yeah, it's
so
much more
instead of just having outlines, you're getting like everything here.
Yeah.
And the nice advantage to this, if you get a more detailed, more complete open grisaille painting like this, is when you go to lay paint on top of it, your actual color paint, if you match, you'll know you're successful if you lay the stroke down and it matches the value right around it, which is a lot easier to tell. It's like putting your value scale right up to a piece of color paint, because you lay the piece of paint down. If it's a significantly different value than what's right next to it, then you know you've probably made a critical error, and you go back and you remix the paint before you apply it. So you really help to isolate that issue, and it can become a very useful guide while you paint.
So do you tend to use full body colors when you come over this so that you don't see the painting underneath?
It just depends on effects you're going for. If you want transparency, if you want this underpainting to show through, there's a lot of potential ways to approach this, either with paint extended with medium or body paint or impasto and allowing some broken edges and things to show through. There's lots of ways that you can decide to do this.
So you mentioned plein air painting. So if you're doing plein air painting or you're doing something that you want to finish, do you have to wait for the grisaille to dry before you can apply paint over it?
Usually, you don't have to. And in fact, this is already, for the most part, so dry to the touch everywhere, even areas that I just put on, that you won't have issues with this mixing too much with the paint you put on. Unless your area that you put on is very, very thinned out. If that's the case, you may have some issues.
Okay.
Doing a little drawing, correcting with the eraser here. So in this open grisaille, I am going to be concerning myself with edges and values more so than I would in an underpainting. What you're going to end up seeing today, since we have 45 minutes today instead of the full hour, is basically, too much paint. Basically what my underpainting would look like for an open studio. And then next week in that second hour, you'll get to see me really start to resolve more of the edge issues and get a little more precise with the values and put in some final accents. We would definitely, if this was going to be an underpainting, we would stop before we put in anything remotely opaque, such as those dark accents. we wouldn't necessarily do that if this is going to be an underpainting, because if it starts to get more opaque and heavier, it's going to be more likely that it could blend with the top layers, which we absolutely would not want if this was to be an underpainting. You could do that, but you would have to wait for this to dry, so it wouldn't be good for a single session or a session that's one day right after another.
So you could, you would do this in open studio, and even though you're doing an alla prima painting, so to speak, but it wouldn't be considered a direct painting, is that correct?
It's not a true direct painting, no, good point, because I am solving this drawing issue immediately. Big shape error here. I had to go in there with mineral spirits to get down there, so I'm going to have to really make sure that my mineral spirits are not so heavy that it drifts down. Luckily it's on the bottom of the canvas, so it's not as big of an issue. So there's an example on the back table there of a like 2 hour or so little open grisaille. Yeah, grab that one. And you can kind of see an effect that we'd be going for as far as an underpainting, maybe a little bit further than an underpainting there. And then when we get upstairs, I'll show you a few portraits that I have on the computer of more examples. And then, you know, there's some artists who do really, really great job developing these into more of a art form, actually, finished works. Like Aaron Westerberg does that a lot, if you've ever heard of him. He's mostly using reds for his tone, so they're definitely red shifted. And the values tend to be a little bit higher key because he's using pigments that are inherently a little lighter. And then Richard Schmid does a great job with a lot of these monochrome paintings here. So those are a couple artists to look at for some really good examples. At least if you were going to be taking these to a really finished level.
And this one at Brittany is only 2 hours?
Yeah, maybe a little less. I mean, it's not very rendered, you can see. I would definitely recommend for open grisaille, if you're going to take a painting more to completion, don't strive to do anything as small as that painting there. Yeah, because you're going to be at a disadvantage for detail. If you're the type of person who feels like they need to be putting in eyeballs and fingers and things like that on your hands, then you have to be working on a canvas that's large enough to support that. If you're going to be doing a smaller figure, it's definitely going to lend itself, for the most part, to a more impressionistic style of painting, just because you have to combine certain areas to suggest anatomy and light instead of actually going in there and defining it. Does that make sense? And you'll sort of see, probably next week when we really start to get into this, how challenging it can be to get these light shapes and not destroy them. You know, if you weren't good with that glazing, or not the veiling with charcoal, if you're the type of person who had to go back and forth, and you went dark, and then you went light, and then you went dark, and then you went light, you're going to have a lot of trouble with this. Because if you have to erase something, it's hard to really shift subtly. It takes out a whole bunch more. So if you end up going back and forth, you may have a difficult time.
When you were doing the one with Brittany, to get the highlights, did you lift those at the end?
Yep, those were lifted at the end. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Another thing you'll notice as you start to do this today, especially as you build this up, that it's going to be a lot harder, no pun intended, to get hard edges in this. Everything's going to be softer and softer and softer because we're doing this with relatively soft bristle brushes, and we're building this up, and it's all just kind of merging together and softening together. and we'll build our hard edges in toward the end of the painting. And we'll do that with, like I think Kathy just mentioned, the paper towel with mineral spirits at the end of the painting for some larger shapes, and then a click eraser for some smaller shapes. We've got about 10 minutes here. You guys have any questions? This is about how far I'm expecting you guys to get today. Keep in mind, I am working on a subject that is relatively simple, as opposed to most of the master copies that we have upstairs that are actual paintings with lots of joining elements together. What I'm doing here is an academy study. This was just in class, a model sitting up on the stage. So there's not a whole lot of elements to it. So you have a decision to make when you're doing your master copy. Are you going to sort of block in this whole thing as I was doing here, or are you going to focus a little bit more and just render out one area and put enough background in to put it into context? So that's a choice that you can make on your own. Because if you're doing a copy of an entire still life, for example, you may never really end up getting to develop the painting very far if you try to develop everything together. And just like with everything else in this class, I want you to be able to experience all the stages of the painting, not just a block in. So I would encourage you more to focus on the a particular object that you can develop out.
Are you doing that to smooth out the arm?
No, I need to extend the shape to the right.
Okay.
So that was a shape correction.
Because right now I'm noticing that there's a little bit of a horizontal, you know, it's not completely smooth on the arm. You know, it's a little bit more, there's a little striping going on.
Oh, on here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Take care of that later.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That'll be pretty easy to fold, especially since I know I'm going to have to be manipulating the value and probably the shape even a little bit later on. So that does bring up another point too. You know, in the drawing, I was really encouraging everybody to clean up your passage after you've done a veil, so that you have a better judgment of what the actual value is. Here though, we wouldn't necessarily want to smooth that out and waste time doing that. We want to consider the elements all connected to it. But again, it depends on how small of a piece of the canvas you're doing. If you're only doing this much canvas, then you probably smooth it out to take it to the next level. As I start to add more of the dark, and notice she's looking lighter and lighter. In fact, she's probably looking a little too light right now. I'll have to go in there and scumble over a little bit of paint to bring her down in value, especially right in here. She's looking glowing up in here even. But there's some shape issues that I'm going to resolve here before I get too carried away with the value. And so getting the value of big areas like this is important, because if we were trying to mix, for example, a flesh tone to go over that area, and we got the color perfectly, and we think we've got the value perfectly, and we lay it on there, and it looks dark because we've had this so light, then we're going to be tempted to go back and try and lighten up that flesh tone color and ultimately make it too washed out and chalky. So if this were going to be an underpainting to go on top of, this big value would be something I'd want to address a little sooner. Or at least have addressed before I advance the actual body paint.
But are you ultimately though trying to get the background and the body the same value differences apart?
Well, that's a good question. It depends on whatever you want. It doesn't matter. In this particular case, I will try to get the full value range. But if this were going to be again, like an open studio painting, especially if I'm limited on time, the background is not something I'm going to really concern myself with, except to put the figure into context. So I would use the background just enough to get these values right, and then I'd stop touching the background, and then go full into painting the figure. Especially, backgrounds and in an open studio capacity are really unimportant. They exist only to serve the subject. So one of the faults I see in some people in open studio is that they'll spend so much time painting the background and just really trying to get all the value variations they see in the background, and then not enough time on the figure. And you can tell which one they spent more time getting proportionally. So instead of trying to get the exact color and value of the background in an open studio, I suggest you strive your best to get the correct value and color of your subject, and then use the background to make the subject look more correct. It's easier to paint a background because it's a big, flat color shape. So that's much easier to get than the subtlety of the figure. And that's why people like to do it, because it's easier to do than the subject. So knowing that, we should say, well, let's spend a lot of time on the subject, and then if we need to make that background a little bit darker to make the subject appear lighter, then we'll do that, or a little lighter to make the subject appear darker, we'll do that, and have the background work for us instead of making our subject look less correct. So that's definitely something to consider. Looks like I should be set up pretty well for next week. So throughout this painting, I was squinting enough to try and make this subject appear more as, again, abstract shapes instead of an actual person. For example, when I'm painting the arm, I'm just trying to get this sort of rectangular shape here. I'm just trying to get this squared off shape for the shoulder. I'm not thinking to myself, this is a shoulder, I need to render out the anatomy of a shoulder, etc., etc. All that anatomy stuff we can handle when we're actually working with paint. Really get that down there, and then here focus on the overall big relationships, focus on the overall value pattern and shapes of everything. Again, just like with drawing. Notice how today I have not even started to get into my small brushes yet. I'm still working with my medium-sized brushes here.
Is that towel completely dry, Jim?
It is,
Yep.
yeah. I'm going to be very reserved in putting mineral spirits on the towel or brush. It'll only be if I've done all the wiping I can do with a towel or brush without mineral spirits, and I can't get down to a value that I think I really need to be at, then I'll slowly start to introduce mineral spirits. And just like with drawing, as time is coming to an end, I want to refocus my efforts on just overall relationships, make sure I make the most effective large changes I can in the amount of time that I have. Try to avoid noodling at the very end. Noodling is, with any painting, it's good to consider, especially in an open studio capacity. Noodling in the last 5 minutes will do nothing to really advance the correctness of the painting. It'll only bring the finish of that painting a little further. It's more effective to spend your time thinking about those large relationships and make sure you don't have anything that's super majorly off. We do have this really great luxury that next week we get to come back and revisit these paintings. So if there is something that's significantly off, it'll really jump out at us next week, which you don't get in an open studio. In an open studio, you know, that's it. So you have to really take special advantage of all the breaks that are offered in open studio, because those are certainly not just for the model, but meant for you, the artist, to be able to walk away and assess your work, since you don't get to come back the next day. So that's really important to consider. Squint, squint, squint.
Can we get our cards for Open Studio?
Oh yeah, Dan didn't give you guys any cards?
No.
Yeah, we'll get you some cards today.
And do you think we can do this Open Grisaille?
Yeah, this is definitely something you're allowed to and should be practicing in open
I
studio.
have a
Yes,
question
Dr. Go ahead.
about your painting.
Okay.
You left the area between her scapulas really brightly white.
Uh-huh.
Any reason? Because it's not the lightest light.
Yeah, I'm going to develop, well, it is the lightest light right here.
No,
but I'm going to,
between her scapulas.
yeah, you're talking about right here,
No,
Yeah.
below
where the fingerprint is?
Yeah,
Lower.
going down.
Lower.
And here?
No.
Yes.
Yeah. Like I said earlier, I'm going to develop that area next week when I get into more refined shapes. So I'm not really too concerned about it now, because there's actually a bit of value modulation in here that may be a little challenging to see from the back, and it's going to be easier for me to adjust that in small patches of very light scumbles. If I get the whole thing overall to that value right now, then next week I'm going to end up doing a lot of back and forth with the eraser and the paint, which I don't really want to do if I can help it. If this were an open studio, like I said, and this was just the underpainting that I was going to paint on top of, I would adjust this value, adjust this value, and adjust this value, and then I would go ahead and start painting.
So the 3 light spots, as I see it, the top one is the lightest, the middle is less light, and then the lower leg is the darkest of the 3.
Uh-huh.
And that's something you'll address next week?
Yeah, because I'm going to model all those areas out next week.
And like the left shoulder, that's just the shoulder cap.
Right.
It
yeah.
looks very bright to me. You would just
Here?
erase that out.
Yeah, I think I'm going to go in there with an eraser next week. Yeah, once it's set up a little. I already did one pass at it, and I don't want to really introduce mineral spirits if I can help it. And actually, I might even be able to now, be able to start to do that. And I'll be able to do hatching and things like that next week when the paint's set up even a little bit more, which is nice. So I think we're about done here. Yeah. Okay, let's go ahead and stop. Upstairs on the computer, I've got a selection of master copies for you if you don't have one yourself, and then we're going to have the office print them out. Luckily, I think they'll print them out in color for us, so we'll be able to work from a color copy. So you'll notice the camera angle has shifted a little bit from the first video that you guys got. I did that because when I reviewed the content for the first video, the camera was placed over here to my right. Even though you could see both the reference and the painting in the same view, the painting ended up being so skewed that it ended up not even really matching up with the reference. So now we're going almost straight on to the painting, and I'll just do a little picture-in-picture for you guys so you can see the reference and compare them side by side for the video here. So last time we were really focusing mostly on getting a solid block in where all of the shapes and values are about in the right spot, and starting to establish that hierarchy of values along with some good drawing on the painting. And that's really what all of this whole open grisaille is about. Trying to get a really solid, basically drawing with paint underneath the painting so that we can jump right in when it's time to add color. So I was sight sizing. I think I'm lined up pretty close to be able to continue doing that. Overall, the drawing is pretty good, but there's a few things that I can go ahead and clean up a little bit. And there's a couple of methods we should be able to use for correcting what we did last week. We should be able to dip in with a paper towel into some paint thinner and be able to work this a little bit still, so you get back down to, well, just about the white of the canvas if you're working on a low prime linen. So it should still be pretty correctable even an entire week later, which you're going to find is not the case when we get to actual body paint. So that'll be the difference between an open grisaille and a closed grisaille also is, anything you did last week, we can still adjust and correct and fix and still have sort of the same amount of paint on the canvas. When we get to a closed grisaille, we're using black and white paint. What you threw up there that first week, that's going to be there. We have to sand it down, oil it out, and try to build up on top of it. And of course, introduce another layer of paint. And the more layers of paint we introduce, the more likelihood there is for something to go wrong with the painting later on in the future. So that's why, or one reason why, open grisaille becomes so favored. Because we're still working with that same level of paint. We can keep working the drawing, and working the drawing, and working the drawing, and working the drawing, and figuring it all out, giving us all the good shape, value, edges, and a base color, and not add to the complexity of the painting, so that when we are ready to go into body paint, to our higher level, we won't have to do as much back and forth. So that's a really positive benefit of an open grisaille here. Here we can see just erasing too will get us down to the white for some more precise little marks there if we need to get some little guys. What you'll find it's kind of similar now with this paint dry, similar to how it was with working with the charcoal, where erasing out doesn't give us quite that precise line anymore. It's sort of diffused and smoky like it was with drawing. When it's wet though, of course, it is much easier to get that crisp line with the eraser.
So you're going to a smaller brush now?
I am going to a smaller brush now, a little more noodling. There's still some areas where I need to correct a few things. For example, this needs to be brought to about right in here, so I'll trim this down. And notice when I trim it down, I'm not just making a new outline, I'm actually working into it with the adjacent shape.
And what you're doing now could still be corrected, for lack of a better term, later, right?
Yep, yeah. Everything that I'm doing today will still be very, very workable. So if I wanted to, another week from now, I could go back in and start laying into this open grisaille again to solve some of these problems.
Now, when you move into a closed grisaille, will that be on top of an open grisaille or in place of it?
Either. Some artists do both, some artists only do one. Because even if you are going to do a closed grisaille to allow for some glazing and things like that, an open grisaille can still be a good idea because then you still can work out all the kinks with your drawing and placement and values and all that sort of stuff without adding the extra paint layers. Since you are intending to glaze, those paint layers can get pretty large in number.
If you were to do closed grisaille over this, would that pick up any of what you've already got down and potentially screw up your...
Not if it's been allowed to dry for maybe 15 or 20 minutes.
Okay.
Once the mineral spirits evaporate out, it will be a pretty solid drawing, just sort of like a charcoal drawing, basically. You'll still be able, or there will still be the danger, one could say, of it lifting up as you apply your next layers of paint, but that will depend on more on factors of the next layer of paint, such as if you're using thinner with it or what type of medium you may be using with it. So now I'm actually getting closer to true values down in here, and you can see now how light this is. And it did lighten up a little bit. It has sunken in just a bit. If we were to rub oil on it, we would be able to bring out the original richness, but with an open grisaille, you wouldn't necessarily want to oil it out. We don't want to introduce another layer of oil. That would be against the point of the open grisaille.
Tim, are you intending to put her face, her cheek in, or are you?
Yeah, I'll probably block that in
Okay,
as well.
just curious.
That's such a small shape
Yeah.
that I would rather handle that after I've solved some of the big issues.
Mhm.
You'll notice when I do need to add mineral spirits, I dip into the mineral spirits and get a little on my brush, and then I rub out the excess on the palette because I don't want to completely load up the puddle I'm working with mineral spirits. So I've got a lot of extra mineral spirits there, and those will just evaporate out pretty quickly. But above all else, I do not want things to turn soupy today. If something gets soupy, like even that's a little wet, it could start to run and it could start to ruin your drawing that you have underneath.
Can you also blot it on a paper towel or something like that? I found I needed to do that with the samples.
With the brush, block the
Yeah.
brush with a paper
Yeah,
towel.
yeah.
Yeah, you can do that, and it depends on how absorbent your brush is, whether that'll work well or not. If you're using a really absorbent brush, it may suck out all of the mineral spirits. If you use a cheap paper towel, absorbent paper towel, it'll pull out all the mineral spirits. A cheap paper towel, like these paper ones, will not take out much of anything at all. So it kind of just depends. I went back to a slightly larger brush so I can get some of these bigger shapes in here.
If you would oil that out on, a later date, wouldn't you just run the risk of picking up everything you've done?
You could, and that's one reason why you wouldn't oil this out.
Yeah, but that would depend on how aggressive you got with the oil.
Oh, I get very aggressive.
Oh, you did? Rubber sheets and everything.
But if you were going to put body paint on it, do you need to oil it out?
No,
Okay.
not at all.
Just, oil it, like wine or something? Is that the thing, blown oil or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, oiling out is not necessary at all to the open grisaille process.
Will it take it out, the oil?
It depends how aggressively
Yeah.
you scrub it, yeah.
Well, the whole purpose of this is an underpainting, right? Not something that should survive on its own.
Well, if you like it,
yeah,
you
you
spray it
can,
with varnish on it.
if you do want it to survive, you would spray it, fix it, basically.
I like them. They're nice.
Yeah, there's a lot of artists who do them on their own, and even we can see some historical examples of this type of painting, either done for, oftentimes done for studies, but nevertheless they've survived through history for us to see.
So if you don't put the varnish on it, like in the way down the line, you could still remove it, or just?
Yeah, in fact, nature will probably remove it for you.
Mm.
It will crumble or crack.
You mean paint film, right?
Yeah, I think one of the textbooks refers to it as powdering. It will powder off.
Well, that makes sense.
It's old and it's
Yeah,
thin.
there's not enough binder in there to keep it. So ultimately, this ends up being kind of like a very similar to just like a pastel type of drawing,
Mm.
chalk pastel drawing, but with even less binder than is in chalk pastel.
So if you put it under glass, would that preserve it?
Yes. The first thing you should do every time before you get back up to a painting, or even drawing for that matter, is just going back and correcting or revisiting the work that you've done, reaffirming that what you have is correct before proceeding. I would ill-advise to jump right into starting to render all of this out without giving everything a once-over and bringing everything as a whole a little closer to a finish. Because remember, now the point of today is sort of pushing it past that block-in stage and allowing it to begin to exist as a painting more on its own.
For some reason, I thought you wanted us to work on a section though to completion. Is that true?
Yes, yeah. So you'll have to basically pace this to your own timing. And you know, I have this advantage that I'm not doing a figure in the midst of a bunch of other stuff. It's just a figure with a black background. So really this is a section, or would be considered a section of a painting. I don't necessarily, when I say do a section of it, I don't necessarily mean, you know, just focus on the arm and spend 2 hours rendering out the arm. But if you have like the figure with the waves and all that sort of stuff, or multiple figures, focus on one figure and render that out instead of everything together. Because what you did last week, your blocking last week should have been everything together, at least to a blocking degree. And then today we're just going to push everything to the next level. When I need to distribute the charcoal or the paint a little more evenly, again, remember I'm going onto the side of my brush to scrub that in. It doesn't matter as much over here. I'm not really concerned about how evenly it's distributed. But when I am concerned, if I was going to go really far with this, see how I get this on the side and make this really nice and clean? When I just, how even it is compared to something like this. So again, if you're going like this, it's going to get choppy and you might not be able to control it as well, something like that with that dry brush. But if we get onto the side, we can start to scumble that in a little more controlled. The big challenge with this type of painting too is getting detail areas. And you'll have to eventually down the road start to get to paint that has a little more body to it. Again, I strongly discourage you from going there too quickly because it will be very difficult to pull back out.
Doing the open Grisaille?
Yeah. You're gonna lean towards body paint. That's not to say you're gonna put straight body paint on there. You still want it a little thinned down. But something closer to the consistency out of the tube, you'll find, or you have found by now, I'm sure, is much easier to control than paint that's really thinned down. Again, going into more of a scumble here. So as I checked the drawing, I used paint with a little more thinner on it to sort of correct big shapes. And now that I'm going in and starting to isolate smaller areas of value change, I need a little more control, so I'm going back to that scumble. And you'll notice I'm kind of filling it in and cleaning it up each area as I go. I'm not just sort of laying a few, then jumping over, laying a few, jumping over. I'm really trying to get this all nice and fairly smooth in each passage before continuing to the next shape. I don't want it to look too splotchy all over. I don't want that splotchiness to affect how I observe the value changes. Does that make sense? The same reason why we did a little more of the cleanup with the charcoal. It's a little too dark, too much body paint in there, or wet paint. Let's take that out. There we go.
So you use thicker paint then when you're going into the darker values, because the thinner will allow the white to show through?
Yes, also because in most cases the darks are typically a little smaller and will require a little more precision. So even with this open grisaille, where we are just doing an underpainting that would typically actually in reality dry more as one layer, we can still start to observe some of this fat over lean rule if you kind of think about it. Because that first day when we did the overall block in, it was very, very lean. We were putting a lot of mineral spirits in there, covering the whole canvas, et cetera, et cetera. And then today, as we're working towards the top layer, you're going to find that you can't keep doing that because you're just going to lift off a lot of the work you've done already. So instead, we're going to use more pure paint, but we're going to be wiping it off on the paper towel a little bit, like we were when we were practicing scumbling on the brush stroke charts. And I'm still building this up, thinking in terms of veils like we did with charcoal.
So, Tim, for the lower arms, would you make it all dark and then come in and sort of erase it out to get that kind of dark but slightly lighter tone?
Maybe for over here, because I went a little dark, but lifting it off just like that is enough. What I'd rather do, and if your skill level is up to it, the best suggestion would be to, with that first thin paint block in, try to get as close to the starting point of all the values in an area as you can. So for example, like this arm now is about the starting point or around the starting point of the lightest values in that arm. And then I would want to sort of veil or scumble the rest of the values onto it. As opposed to doing as much back and forth, I want to try and observe a little bit more of what we observed with drawing, where that after that stump, that initial stump, it gave us the starting point kind of for light and the starting point for dark, and then we just veiled darker on there. That's kind of what we should try to shoot for, just as a time saver, if nothing else, and also to prevent too much back and forth. But I'm hoping that your drawing skills and your ability with value right now is enough to a point where you can start to isolate the area and not be influenced by surroundings, and then work in a base value from there. What I would definitely not suggest is to, like with the head, block in the head really light and kind of leave it there and not want to touch it. I would encourage you to at least get close to the starting point of the value if you're going to in fact block it in. Because then you'll be too scared to lose that head. Like if you spend a lot of time drawing it but paint it in too lightly, you'll be afraid to lose it later on.
So when you squint, the head almost disappears.
Right, so that's why, this is sort of the starting point for the head right now, so that's as much as I need to do. And I don't want to get too many dark values in the background yet before I've built up the rest of it, so that's why I haven't even addressed it. It'll be down the road. I might not even get too far into it today. If anything, I'll probably just end up kind of blocking in the division between the hairline and the face. I definitely want to squint a lot here at this stage. Squint, squint, squint. Always squinting. So even though there's anatomy there, I'm still trying to think in terms of just light and just dark at this stage. Like we did with all of our drawings on white. If this was if I was going to take this to a closed grisaille, I would shift my thinking to anatomy when I am ready to start adding in that body paint. And then I would start following the contours of the anatomy with the body paint to help increase the illusion of the form. But if I jump ahead too soon to anatomy, there's, especially on a subtle pose like this, and I've already done it to some degree, so now I'm having to go back and correct it, is there's that tendency to straighten out the anatomy and make things level and make things symmetrical and things like that. And usually that's an indication that I'm not squinting enough to see things as they are in terms of light and dark. I'm focusing too much on something that should be handled later on down the road. So I just go back to squinting. Just about this whole open grisaille should be thought of or approached in very abstract ideas of shape, value, and edge as opposed to anatomy. Because this is just an underpainting. This is basically your design and your setup to add everything to. So this gives you an opportunity to see how values look together, how shapes look together, how the painting will come together before you even begin to add all of the bits of color and things. This abrasive action that I'm having to use to correct some of these areas is precisely the reason why I recommend board for this exercise as opposed to canvas. If you're using canvas, you will have to be a little bit more gentle because you may dent or score the canvas if you erase or scumble too hard.
How about for the closed grisaille? Is that an issue or not?
As far as working on board,
Uh-huh.
it shouldn't be, but even with the closed grisaille, you may want to do a bit of a open grisaille underpainting to figure out where things go, because you'll find too, if you haven't worked with paint, that white tends to infiltrate everything, and if you sort of block everything in and it ends up being a little haphazard and incorrect, and you've done it with body paint, then it's going to be really challenging to overcome that and get back to nice clean values. So it may be wise to just get in the habit of doing at least a quick open grisaille and then take a break and then revisit it and make sure that all the shapes are in about the right spot. So for that reason, at least make sure you're working on something that is a nicely stretched canvas and something that's relatively firm and not too saggy. Inexpensive linens, you'll find, are not made as durably, so you'll dent into them and they won't have the spring back that more expensive canvases will have, and they won't be as tough and resistant to this sort of working.
Why are you using the click eraser instead of, for example, a soft brush with a little thinner on it?
Because I don't want to introduce too much thinner to this higher layer. The last thing I want is a little too much thinner here that drips down and then ruins all the values I've established, and then I'm going to have to go back in and redo all that blocking stuff. So I want to get further and further away from paint with mineral spirits at this stage.
So you wouldn't want to lift off at all, really?
Only if I was like really, really, really far off. So think of a paper towel with mineral spirits as being kind of like the kneaded eraser. You're using it for big shapes that really need correcting, and you're probably going to rip off a lot more than you needed to, and you're going to have to go back in and work it. And think of this click eraser as you would a click eraser, to draw on really precision fine adjustments that are much more controlled. So you just scumble in very, very light veils.
Have you ever used any of the synthetic brushes, that you know what I'm talking about, there's like
Which one?
silicone? I'm just wondering if something like that would also.
Silicone.
Oh, those like spatula things?
Yeah, that you can buy.
Yeah. No, not really. They would work for some purposes. They work really well for sort of knocking down topography you have on a more dry painting. But for distributing paint, I don't think they're quite as ideal.
Tim, you're down to a minute.
Okay. So now I'm getting all these subtle transitions. I know we had the question last time, it was kind of like, well, these three spots are kind of the same value last week. And yes, that's true. The paint was so wet last week that if I come in here to try and do something like this on the paint that was there, it would have just smushed it all around and rubbed it around. So now I can come back in and get a lot more of these subtle adjustments in place. And even this level of finish can be nice for an underpainting, because then you get an idea of not just how things look with the value, but you can start to get more of a sense of form.
So let's say you got this kind of all completed for your underpainting, then do you then look at it and decide what values and colors you're going to use for everything and kind of lay that all out in advance before you start messing with it?
Yeah, that would be a great idea. And in fact, if you have a more advanced underpainting like this, then it'll be a lot easier to figure out which group of red, yellow, and blue to go to. Or if you want to work with a limited palette, we would conversely handle it by doing some color studies, which we'll learn how to do a few weeks from now. And then once you've found the correct limited palette you would like to use, then you just mix it, mix it, mix it, and as you lay it up there, if it doesn't match the value you have underneath, it's a red flag. You need to stop what you're doing, wipe off the stroke if you need to, remix a new piece, and then lay it up there and get it to match in. If it doesn't match the values right next to it as a seamless flow, then that's a really good red flag for you to consider. All right, so come along here. I'm liking how this is developing up in here. It's getting closer to the value range I need. This is coming along pretty well in here. You'll notice that actual shape correcting can be very, very challenging at this stage. This is the thing you're going to notice. This is more of a modification and sort of refinement, slightly nudge stage. But for example, I just went in to go and adjust this contour a little bit here. And it's very, very hard to do when I'm working with a small amount of dry brush paint. That's something I'm going to have to either go in with thin paint, which can risk damaging the surrounding areas, or wait till later and go in with thicker paint or more body paint in this dark area to correct that contour. So this is not the stage you would be really nudging around anything big. This is just little bits here, little bits here, little bits here, and sort of working on all your smaller bracketed shapes. But it comes all down to, so like everything we've talked about so far, even in the last year of drawing, you know, organizing everything well enough so that you can handle timing, and you can handle the stages without messing up your previous stages. You know, drawing is not such a big deal. Even if there is a critical shape error, you can go back to a certain degree and fix it, just like you can with painting. But I'm sure you all have found with a drawing that you know, after you spend a lot of time on an area and then you go back in and realize that something's really wrong, it can be either a pain in the butt or even impossible to adjust the drawing to the degree you need it to. Luckily with painting, we can always swoop over it with more body paint. But as far as the underpainting is concerned, if you miss that window of correct shape, again, you're going to find that it's a lot more work and a lot more time consuming to come back and fix it later on. Does that make sense?
So Tim, I think at her top of her thigh seems to stick out more on the reference photo.
Top of her thigh, this here?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's because this needs to come in. And that was the correction
Okay.
I was trying to make,
Okay.
but I couldn't make it this stage of the painting.
Yeah. If you
So-
wanted to take it out more and you're in that dark, could you still do it, or would you have to,
Oh, you mean extend it this way?
not her hip, but see where she has
The fat of her cheek.
yeah, fat of her
Right here.
cheek? Yeah,
Yeah.
right there. Could you do that?
Could I
Eraser?
extend it out?
Yeah, could you extend it out?
I could, but right now it's lined up nicely
Okay.
to the shoulder.
Okay.
So this isn't the issue. This doesn't need to go out. This actually needs to go
Okay.
in.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you could do that with a clip.
No, I would do this with body paint and going into carpet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tim, when you go to a smaller brush, do you use like a soft or a mongoose to avoid scraping?
No, and you'll find it's almost impossible if you didn't already with the brush chart exercise to do a really controlled, accurate scumble with a soft brush like that. Because the brush just sort of sways and goes everywhere and you can't really get it in the spot you need. You want something fairly stiff that you can work
Yeah,
little
but not
delicate
for the
things.
stumbling, but for the fine detail.
No, you'll again want something fairly precise because you're still working, remember, with thinned paint. It's not complete body paint for the fine detail.
So basically, a bristle brush is probably mainly what you'll use for this?
Yeah, you won't use too much more than bristle brushes here. Because if you do, and this is one of the big red flags, you'll realize that the paint is so hard to pick up and control and apply that you're going to want to go dipping into thinner to make it work. And then it'll end up being just so soupy at this stage that you won't be able to modulate things on the level you need. Yeah, if you're used to working a painting, as most students are, in both oil and acrylics, and you know the paint consistency is too thick to handle appropriately, the temptation is always to dip into water or dip into a thinner to make it more workable. But we have other options here. We can introduce a medium if need be. We can even alter the brush we're using to make the paint more usable.
Oh, so you can use medium at this point?
No.
Close, yeah.
I'm just saying one of the downfalls is over thinning of paint, you'll see, and because students want to use soft brushes, and when the paint's not workable with a soft brush, they typically dip into thinner and thin it out too much. But what I'm telling you is use a bristle brush instead, and then you can control stiffer paint.
You know, using the soft brush on those brush stroke charts, both humongous and soft, it's almost impossible to do full body or impossible with the softer brushes.
Exactly. So you can see why students typically tend to thin it out because they are working with a set of cheap or soft brushes that can't pick up body paint, and so they thin everything out, and then their painting gets chalky and washed out or whatnot. All the negative effects that happen with over-thinned paint. And instead of selecting the appropriate brush for the for the task at hand. Does that make sense? That should be a very clear indication. One of the reasons why you were to do the brush stroke charts. Just adding a nice veil over this whole area, darken that up. The background almost bleeds into this leg here. Just a little bit. So if there's a hard dried paint line there. Might have been a little too thick last week. This is the only real licking of the canvas you guys will get to do. Sort of scrubbing, scumbling motion. And you can keep note though, you can only be this carefree if it's a monochromatic painting. If this were a color painting and I was going to do this scumbling, I would have to be quite a bit more careful to ensure that I didn't mess up or mix any colors accidentally.
When would you scumble in a color painting? Is it something you would do in a later stage?
Yeah, it's actually typically more of a top coat. So it's still pure paint. You wouldn't necessarily do it over a super fatty area of paint, but you could, but it's a little more dangerous. And it would be just to typically add a little bit of light to an area. So kind of like the reverse of what we're doing. Now we're scumbling to get darks, but at the end of the painting you would kind of scumble to get lights, and it would add a little topographical section to the painting to make it look a little more three-dimensional. Because it does, as you can see, stay rather transparent.
Well, would you also use it for broken color to do like visual blending of two different colors?
Yeah, you can. Between the passage of, are you talking about like if you have a color here and a color here and you scumble between them?
Or whatever, yeah. Well, not necessarily between them, but if you have an area where the color is too harsh or too dark.
Oh, and you
or
need
whatever,
to
so-
modify it down? Yeah, either a scumble or a glaze will work appropriately for that. It just sort of depends on what the effect you want. A glaze would typically be something used for more of a background because it darkens it and it also sort of unifies the color together while helping it recede because the paint film is flat. Whereas a scumble typically is done for bringing an area together lighter as opposed to darker, and it brings it forward a little more. So both would be used. You just have to select if you're using it for light, if you're using it for dark, background, or foreground. Does that make sense?
Right.
And this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then-
I'm waiting.
Oh, was that bugging you?
Yes.
I should have left it for like the last 2 minutes.
It's very bright compared to everything else.
So what I do, and you may or may not have developed this tendency yet through your drawing, hopefully you've started to, is you can work on one area at a time, and while you're working on that one area, relate it to the whole. Which allows you to not have to bounce everywhere all at once to try and get everything to look right. I can work on this section here and always be thinking about this section up here and this section down here. And then I can go to the next section and always think about this. So I'm working one at a time more than bouncing everywhere, which is why I didn't need to address the leg right now because I was making these work towards each other and the overall instead of with all three of them and think bouncing here and looking back there and having it confuse me. So I'm referencing only the areas which are more finished when I'm relating it as opposed to referencing the whole thing. Does that make sense? And that's sort of a whole like top-down painting kind of mentality. You're always referring back to the areas you've done earlier that are more complete rather than referring to the areas that are less complete to put everything into context. But keep in mind, though, that's really only a good philosophy if the earlier areas you have are close to being correct.
Yeah.
But I've always been in the habit, ever since I started painting, of, and now I don't do it quite as much, but earlier on I did, of trying to get an area as finished as I possibly can before moving on, so that I can use that as a reference point. Which not as many people, and especially students, tend to do because they want to get something that looks good right away. So that's why I'm not one of those painters who goes into Open Studio and finishes the painting in 1 hour and it looks great. Because I'm spending that 1 hour getting one thing right in anticipation that I'll spend the rest of the time measuring my shapes against that earlier shape. So you can work either way. Some people are really good at building up everything together. I just like reference points and reference materials.
So are you using that, you get one area done, shape, edge, value, color,
Mhm.
before you move to the next and then key everything off of the first one?
Yes, so that's my typical painting method.
Okay.
And so you can see the Open Studio stuff I've done that's upstairs, which was executed in that method.
Okay.
So still a few areas that need to be veiled down, but we're getting pretty close here. That hair will help this shape make a little more sense. can start to soften those edges there. This arm pulls in a little bit more, so I'm gonna have to probably lift some of that out. It's a little thin right now because I've got about a fifth of it there in the dark. That's okay. If I've done it today, it'll be pretty easy to remove. If I did it last week, I'm gonna have to work at it. It looks like it's pretty wet. If it's wet enough, if I've done it today, I can work the same eraser methods that I did last week, which is like a dry, clean brush lifting out or a paper towel scrubbing out. If it was something that was done last week, I'm gonna most likely have to use the eraser at this point.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
no, it's
Yeah, the soundtrack now. There we go, something like that. Torso studies are great, and this will probably be the first type of painting, figure painting that we do in the program for you guys, because then you don't have to think as much about the face. So we're probably going to have the model turned away from you guys and you focus on painting the back, because it will also be a shorter painting. You know, you'll have, I think, 3 sessions to do it and get through all the stages. So I'm expecting not just an open grisaille of it.
When are we doing that?
Third term. You'll be building up to this. So you'll have enough practice with color by then, and hopefully this whole idea of drawing with paint by then, that you'll be able to handle at least a torso. A torso study like this would be a really nice addition to your portfolio.
That's such a clear heart shape. Are you thinking that when you're drawing?
It's such a what?
Heart
Yes.
shape.
Heart shape.
And then there's a face above with the shiny little eyes. It's like, oh my God.
Yeah, I think.
Does
you know,
that help to think that?
Yes, yeah, and you know, Grand Central Academy, I've heard, hopefully I can say this in the video, encourages their students to see the animal shapes in the figure that they're drawing, so they can think of it less in terms of anatomy and more in terms of abstract shapes, much like you would when you stare at clouds and you start to see shapes in the clouds. You kind of want to do that, because then you're like, okay, I'm just trying to capture the little butterfly here, and then the jack-o'-lantern face up here, you know, and you think less and less about, oh, the hip over here needs to be more even to the hip over there because hips are even, you know, things like that. So,
one dark spot in the middle of her back, is that on the model or is that on the print?
what, the what?
The base of her.
The dark spot?
Yeah.
Here?
Well, it looks like a dark spot with a white ring around it.
Oh,
White
that,
ring?
like some moles or something on her back.
Like here?
Right
Yeah.
above it.
And
Oh.
then-
That's the spine, that's the spine. Those are the
It looks like
spine.
moles or something.
Yeah.
It's where the spine starts to dimple.
But I mean, that's on the model, that's not a flaw in the print.
Turn around.
Right, yeah, I think
Where it is.
that's something you should expect to
You can't see
see.
them like that.
Everybody's got one, you just don't look at your butt.
Plenty of covering.
The spine curve that goes from being convex to concave is called the
Weird.
smile. It makes you look at this.
Kathy, I don't think you look at enough ladies' butts.
Convex.
I have to make the videos at least a little bit interesting for when you guys watch them later.
So you just use the eraser to hit that out?
Yeah, that little tiny, more detailed
Yeah,
spot.
yeah, I'm sorry about that.
It's got a little dark in here, so we can
Yes,
put
you
that
chunk
out.
little bugger.
Yeah.
I don't even look at mine.
So this definitely should start to look more like a drawing pretty soon here as you begin to build this up and build this up and build this up.
It's beginning to look juicy.
Beginning to look juicy. And that's a good point too, because people tend to think that the juicy quality or the richness quality of a painting rests in the paint application, when really it's in the correct shape, value, and edge. If you get the correct shape, value, and edge, doesn't matter how you apply the paint, it will look like a juicy painting. Does that make sense? It all comes back to this fundamental sort of thing. Just like with drawing too, you know, if your drawing's going wrong and you can't get a likeness, it's not because you didn't get the little features right, it's because there's probably something fundamentally wrong with the underlying structure of the drawing. The same is true with the painting. If you're not getting that juicy quality, it's not because you need to switch to the magic medium, it's because you need better shape, value, and edge on your painting. We should all take responsibility for our bad paintings and drawings and try to rise up and overcome. If you always search for that magic, what do you call it, Kathy, the Disney brush?
Yes.
Yes, and then you're never going to get better. So we have to just do the best we can, accept that we're humans and we make flaws, especially when we're, like in cases like this where we're working under time constraints. As you guys start to find when you teach, learning to talk and paint, you have to work two separate areas of your brain at the same time. So I've got one that's always thinking problem solving, problem solving, problem solving, problem solving, and then the other that's like, what do I say that's relevant? What do I say that's relevant? And they don't always work together. So sometimes you get irrelevant things, and sometimes my painting is not working out the way it should be. You know, we just do the best we can, and we observe and accept the flaws, and be very objective as much as possible.
Time's up, Tim.
Time's up? All right. What do we have today? We got 10 minutes.
No, I meant in terms of, I guess, your camera.
Okay, yeah, we'll go for another 5 minutes, and then that'll give you guys 5 minutes to set up, and you have 2 hours on your painting. That should be pretty good.
Thanks for setting our places up,
Setting your
Yeah.
places up.
turning the little things around for the pictures. And so
Oh, turning the, yeah.
Well,
The
so
least
we
I
knew
can
where
do.
we were. I mean, I've been in a different place every week, so.
Oh, yeah. You'll probably be in the same place for the Mondays. The color class doesn't really matter.
So we
Here. So, just to recap, a few of the main things to remember. The initial bit of this painting, last week, high and thinner, working on the big relationships and the blocking in of all the important elements. Trying to get the correct placement of shapes as well as an initial placement of values is the primary importance. Then week 2 here, or the next stage of development, we are fairly confident that our shapes are correct and that our initial value placement is correct. And now we can begin on the subtle modulation of values. And we use paint that can be thinned, but we have to really be cautious that we don't over-thin the paint and load it too much up, because then we won't have anything that we can work with. It'll all, at very worst, it'll be hard to control the subtle modulation of value, or at the best it'll be hard to control the subtle modulation of value. At worst, it could drip down and destroy your painting. Like I said, I'll try to give this a little more time. So there might be, it looks like maybe another 1 hour video or so, maybe 2 hour, to get this really finished in a open grisaille. You'll notice even if this is taken out to a finish, there will be some areas that won't match up 100%, like the background. I won't go that dark in the background on an open grisaille, because that would be almost pure paint to get that dark. So I'm going to key this up a bit, even if I do take this out to a finish, because I don't want to get that thick and that fat too soon. So that would be the big main difference. And then keep in mind also, if you're working with if you are working with a color other than black or some variation of black, then you'll have to keep in mind your values may not be able to reach the full extent. You'll get pretty close, because even if I was working with, say, an umber, I could still probably get most of these values on here, but if you're working with a lighter value, like maybe a Venetian red or something exotic like that, you're going to end up having to key all your values a little lighter, because you most likely won't reach the value range that you see here. And it may not be as logical to do if this was intended for an underpainting, it may not be as logical to do an underpainting in one of those colors that don't express the full value range, because then as you go to tile your paint on top of it, you're going to have a keyed value range for your underpainting, and then you'll be trying to have a full value range for your real painting, and then you might start to get confused there. You want your values to be as close to matched up as possible. So in this case, most of this is just about right within the figure, but the background will be a little bit darker in the final. Just a little bit, not too much. I mean, you can isolate and see kind of the difference, and it's not a whole lot between the background and what's there. But in the final painting, I would probably go a hair darker in that background. Not to pure black, that's definitely not a pure black. Like if I were to do something like this, that is far darker than what's up there. So I don't need to go to pure black anyway. It just might be a hair lighter than what's there. Does that make sense?
That's more of an umber, isn't it? Like a little red in it, maybe?
What, on there?
Master copy.
Yeah, there's a little more, actually a little more yellow in there, yeah, if I isolate. So that's about kind of where I expect or hope everybody to be able to get with this. And I really do encourage you guys to go home and push this as much as possible, and especially in Open Studio, try to learn how to do these really well. A nice transition from drawing into painting to get you thinking about the same sort of ideas before we begin dealing with our closed Grisaille paintings.
Can we take our master copy home with us?
You may, yeah. Yeah, go ahead and take it home and see if you can get some more work done on it there.
Me for the one we're doing today?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then also, you know, it would be nice if you guys can try and get an idea, or start to think at least about what you want your closed Grisaille master copy to be like, especially if you don't plan on selecting one that we have here, just so we have a better idea next week, and we don't have to waste as much time. If you can come in on Thursday and let me know kind of what or Wednesday, I'm sorry, and let me know what you're thinking of for your master copy, we can probably get it printed off on Thursday so that you can jump right into it.
That you have?
Yeah, you can definitely look at some today. Yeah. So we'll leave that here. Does anyone have any questions about this? Was that fairly clear about where you should be going next with your paintings? Just remember, after your initial correction, when you go upstairs, start to ease off those mineral spirits, right? And that being said, you're probably going to want to go to a smaller area, because if you're working on a big canvas, you'll find that it's hard to cover a lot of ground without mineral spirits for an underpainting. So localize your efforts to a smaller area of that canvas.
So you're letting the lower arms just kind of fade into the background?
At this point I am. With the level I brought everything up, I don't need to describe those yet unless I'm going to spend more time on it. So if I, this is just like with drawing too, they're so close in value that I'm going to handle it later on down the road. Same rules apply for sure. It's not as important right now to get those described as it is the areas that are in the halftone and light that I can see really easily.
But when you work on it, you said you were going to work on it again and take it to the fullest extent. At that point, we would see a little bit of the.
Yep, yeah, it would be developed quite a bit more. There's some areas that will get lost into the background. I mean, you can see the hand down here and even the wrist, where it's going to be almost no differentiation. And it's described or separated via color in the painting, but of course I don't have that in the drawing, so it will appear just as a lost edge.
If you're going to define it more, you do it with the eraser, not with thin brush.
Oh, down here?
Yeah.
Well, I have to check down there. Well, yeah, it's such a small area. I would rather try doing it with a thin brush or with a eraser first, and then if I'm not making enough progress and it's not working out, then I would probably go in with a paper towel thinned with mineral spirits. But that's sort of like my bazooka gun to really get the job done. I don't want to do that unless I really have to.
If you're trying to get a very even, you know, value, can you use, you know, it tends to be a little splotchy sometimes when you do the scumbling. Can you use the eraser to help bring it out? Get those
You can,
little
yeah,
dark spots
like the
out?
little push and pull thing until
Yeah,
you get it,
yeah.
get it right, yeah. Eventually what would happen is I may select a brush that's even smaller than this, or since this is a filbert, I can just use the tip. And then I would go in a case like this, and really start to get subtle about the scumbling. If I was going to take this out to a super high level of finish, more like, you know, the Mona Lisa was. You know, we should be able to duplicate just about all of the marks that are on there, even with an open Grisaille painting. But it's going to require, again, that, you know, that's the next. After I would finish everything else and bring it up to superficially look like the reference, then the next step would be to get that actual detail in there with a smaller brush or a pointed filbert and 30 hours of labor.